What did we talk about last Thursday? Let's recap. One thing we did was we introduced the Cool Hand Luke essay assignment, which you've all seen Cool Hand Luke by now, or if you haven't, you have a very short period of time to watch it and study it very closely. We all had a great time watching Paul Newman in the 1960s, working out in the sun. And now you need to write an assignment, an essay, analyzing themes of conformity and obedience in the film Cool Hand Luke. It's due this Thursday, and you want to write about conformity, nonconformity, obedience, disobedience, any of the above, any of those, or all of them if you would like. And you want to make some claim and then support it with evidence from the film. What kind of structure should it be? It should be about 4 to 5 pages. It'll be graded. It'll count for a decent amount on your grade, so you want to take it very seriously. I want you to do it 5-paragraph essay style, and this is some kind of brief recap on what kind of essay style that is. And it doesn't have to be exactly 5 paragraphs, but that sort of style. Don't pull any bogus margins or spacing, double space, 12-point font, yada, yada, yada. And we'll evaluate you both on the structure, your ability to conform to this assignment of having a thesis and then supporting it with this structured essay style, and then also on your ability substantively to make a claim and give evidence in support of it. So what are some possible theses? You could make a relatively simple thesis or claim that you'll then support with evidence from the film. An example of that could be Cool Hand Luke is a film that's centrally about disobeying authority. You could make that the thesis of your essay, and you could definitely support that. There's a ton of evidence from the film in support of that. Or you could do something maybe more complicated, like Cool Hand Luke demonstrates how nonconformity and disobedience, though socially unacceptable, are essential to individual happiness and fulfillment. And that would be an interesting essay you could write about how Luke requires nonconformity and disobedience in order to be fulfilled as a person. Any questions about this? Okay. All right, great. So I look forward to seeing your essays on Thursday, and I'll probably try to grab a couple of the coolest of these essays. I'll probably try and grab a couple of the coolest theses to present in class. Okay, cool. So obedience to authority. We were doing the obedience to authority lecture on Thursday, and we got about halfway through it. So where were we? Okay, so we presented the definition of obedience to authority, and then we talked about the famous story of Abraham and Isaac, and this biblical example of obedience to authority, which has many, many interpretations. And this isn't a theology class, so I encourage you to look those up somewhere else. But it's an interesting way to illustrate the significance of themes of obedience to authority in the history of literature and human thought. Then we talked about the Milgram experiment, and we recapped in a fair amount of detail how the sort of basic study design worked, as well as the results for a few specific conditions in the experiment, including one where there's no appearance of the Confederate. They're just a voice and pounding, or no voice. They're just pounding on the wall. Very high rates of obedience. But also the one from that's roughly the same as the one in the film, where the Confederate, the learner, is while being shocked, has verbal complaints that are played over an audio system, and about the same levels of authority. And then these conditions where the learner is coming closer and closer to the teacher, even to the extent where the teacher presses the learner's hand down on a shock plate, apparently electrifying this person right next to them. And we still find surprisingly high rates of obedience to authority. And I want to remind you that these rates of obedience to authority are rates of people going all the way to the XXX 450-volt level. They're not just rates of any kind of obedience at all. So in this 65% here, the other 35%, a fair number of them went pretty high on the scale. Okay. So then we talked about some other conditions, yada, 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 more and more conditions. Women do it about the same rate as men. I believe that was replicated in the study that you watched. Didn't they replicate this finding that women obey at about the same rates as men in the film that you watched? Yeah. Let's see here. Okay. Yes. Okay. No, we already did that too. Okay. So we did the Thomas Blass meta-analysis, which showed that there's no correlation between year and rates of obedience in various replications of the Milgram experiment. So as we've gotten further and further from the early 60s, rates of obedience in the study haven't particularly declined. And this is so much so that the replication that you watched from Santa Clara University found about the same rates of obedience as in the original study from the early 60s. Okay. William Shatner, got to talk about that. Every session we talk about William Shatner at least briefly. And then we talked about some factors that affected obedience to authority, or rates of obedience to authority. And those included the proximity of the victim. When the victim's closer, the teacher, the subject in the study, tends to obey at a lower rate, probably because they're more aware of the harm they're doing to the learner, and they're also more aware that the study is totally, entirely real, because they can see the learner going through all of this agony, being shocked. Also, the proximity of authority matters, probably for a variety of reasons as well. The closer that the authority figure is, this experimenter who's played in the film, who says freaky stuff like, the experiment must continue, that guy, the closer he is to you, the more you tend to obey his orders. And there's a variety of reasons for that, including that people may actually be afraid of this skinny man in a white lab coat, which I think we all would be. So, what are some conclusions? Now this is new material. What are some conclusions that come out of the Milgram experiment? Well, one is that, well, this isn't really a conclusion, but it's an implication, is that obedience can lead to belief. If you obey authority and follow directives of an authority figure, you may at first feel tension and discomfort. You may at first feel cognitive dissonance because you don't want to kill this person. You don't want to administer these shocks to this person. But what may happen over time is that your thoughts tend to fall in line with your behavior. Remember that coming out of the cognitive dissonance part of the class, one of the central observations was that people walk into social psychology thinking you have a thought and then you have behavior. And that thought creates the behavior. But it's just as much the case in the history of social psychology research that we find that behavior comes first and then thought tends to follow. That circumstances, the power of the situation, maybe orders from some authority figure, can compel you to behave in some way, and then thereafter your thoughts will tend to fall in line with that behavior. That's why we try to get alcoholics to just quit drinking. We don't try to get them to not like drinking. That would take forever. You try to get them to quit drinking, and then their thoughts will sort of fall in line with that abstinence from drinking. And the great illustration of this is the $1, $20 experiment, right? Where these people go through a study, and they're told, or they go through this study that's incredibly boring, right? Turning pegs in holes like quarter turns at a time for like a half hour. An awful, awful experiment that none of them enjoyed at all. And then they're asked, or they're told by the experimenter, go tell the next person in this study that this study is awesome, that this study is just thrilling and exciting and the best time you've had all semester. And they do this. They all comply because people tend to do what experimenters tell them to do, as the Milgram experiment gives evidence for. And it's a small request, right? So 100% of them do it. It's not like asking somebody to shock somebody to death. And in the condition where they're given $20, they say they don't change their belief at all. They say, okay, the person told me to tell somebody a lie, but I was paid $20. I was bought off. I have a good reason for this. But in the condition where they're asked to lie to the next person, they're asked to tell them turning pegs a quarter turn at a time is very exciting, and they're only given $1 to do this lie, they feel great dissonance. And so what do? They decide that the actual experiment was interesting. And what is that? Is that Fessinger and Carl Smith 59? I think so. Okay. So that study illustrates that obedience to authority can create real belief as a result of cognitive dissonance. You obey a directive. Can you be quiet, please? Thank you. You obey a directive to lie to somebody in this study, and then you later decide, oh, it wasn't a lie, I really believe this. And so it's very much the case that when people, can you guys be quiet? I just asked you to be quiet. Okay, if I have to ask anybody multiple times to be quiet and lecture again, you're out. You're out of here. And I'm totally serious. It's starting to really get under my skin. Okay. God damn it. Okay, so, sorry. Okay. So obedience to authority can lead to real belief. As people fall in line with the directives of authority, they may then come to endorse them as a way to reduce their cognitive dissonance. Okay, another conclusion coming out of research on obedience. Obedience is not conformity. It is not the same as conformity. This is a very important distinction. A lot of people lump the two together and don't make a distinction between the two. They just kind of think of them as the same thing. And they look a little bit the same. In both obedience and conformity, you're influenced. You do something different than what you would have done otherwise, were you on your own. So that's one commonality. There's influence in both cases. But in terms of the source and reasons for the influence, it's very, very different, right? In conformity, you imitate what others around you are doing. And we talked about two different ways in which you might do that, normative influence and informational influence. You might imitate and replicate the attitudes or behaviors of the people around you either because you think they got it right, and you're trying to figure out what the right answer is, or the right appropriate thing is to do, what the right answer is in, say, the Sharif experiment, or you might do it because of normative influence, where you're doing it to not look stupid, not be embarrassed, to try and get social approval or avoid social disapproval. So two different ways in which you could conform. In obedience, you follow orders from an authority figure. So inherently, obedience requires some kind of hierarchy of power, authority, social standing, where one person is perceived as a legitimate person who can give orders to another person. So obedience involves following orders. Conformity involves imitation. So the Milgram study does not demonstrate conformity. Well, in one condition it does, and in that condition it's when there's two people that disobey, and then you tend to conform to their disobedience and not obey authority. But that's a study where they almost set up Ash versus Milgram, which is bigger, conformity or obedience to authority. You have a question? Okay. So the Milgram study does not demonstrate conformity in general, except in that one condition. It is oriented towards demonstrating obedience. So it's not the case that the guy in the white lab coat is shocking someone to death, and then you do it to fall in line with what's apparently normative, to conform to what seems appropriate. You're not conforming. Rather, he's telling you what to do, and you do it as an act of obedience. Okay. Another big conclusion. This is a big, big conclusion that we're going to hammer over and over in this class. I'll get to you in a second. And it's that the situation matters, not the individual. Okay? You look at the rates of obedience across the different conditions in the Milgram obedience experiment, and you see some pretty big differences, right? So conditions can be made where nearly everyone will obey. Remember that the very first set of conditions that Milgram tried to do, he just had somebody's outline against an opaque or like a translucent window, and you could see some indication there was a person there, and then you're pressing these buttons. And in that condition, essentially 100% obeyed. And he was like, wow, that's too high. I would actually like a lower rate of obedience, which is an interesting reaction. And so conditions can be made where everyone will obey, but it's just as much the case that conditions can be made in the Milgram experiment where essentially no one will obey. Remember the Ash versus Milgram condition, where there's two disobedient Confederates. You still got the dude in the white lab coat giving you orders, saying the experiment must continue, but you have two role models who are exerting, informational and normative influence on you, essentially saying, they don't say it, I don't think, but they say, I'm not going to do this, and then you tend to fall in line with their behavior. And obedience to authority drops to about like 10%, I think it was. So we can make a condition where everybody in the study will obey 100% of the time, and we can make a condition where essentially no one will obey in the study. And so what does that mean? That means that if you wanted to know if somebody was going to obey or not in the study, you'd want to know what condition of the study they were in. You wouldn't want to know what was their background, how do they relate to their parents, are they extroverted, are they altruistic. You want to know which condition of the study they were assigned to. And that's a great insight on social life, right? That if you want to know how somebody's going to behave, it's extraordinarily important to understand the context of their behavior. Essentially, what conditions are they being assigned to as they find themselves in social life? Yes, you have a question?
My question was back to the example of the alcoholic and actually, from what I've heard and read, the alcoholics fall back until they change their identity as from an alcoholic to a normal person.
Mm-hmm.
And until they do that, they will fall back to alcoholics.
Mm-hmm.
So does that go against
The question is, alcoholics sometimes struggle to quit drinking, and until they can establish a new identity as not an alcoholic, they fall back off. And I would say that's totally consistent with the thesis, that you have to come to view yourself as someone who isn't an alcoholic, and that happens as a result of establishing a pattern of not drinking. But especially with alcoholism, there's a physical addiction involved. It's very hard to shake. It can be as tough as shaking heroin or something. So, it's an extreme example where it is extremely difficult to set up the behavior leads to belief cycle. But I actually think it's a pretty good example. Yes?
In a court of law, can the defense, I was following orders, be used? And do you know of an example that's been okay in the military, for example?
The question is, given that people tend to obey at such high rates in certain conditions of research and obey at such low rates in other conditions of these kinds of studies, is it the case that you could get off in a trial, from like a murder charge by saying I was just following orders? We're about to get to that. We're about to get to a famous trial that maybe partly influenced the creation of the Milgram experiment, where that exact defense was used. So that phrase comes from the trial that we're about to cover. So we'll get to that. Laura. No. Well, no. Well, yes. I mean, okay, so you could have a situation where everyone is following orders and you're receiving orders as well, and there's both conformity and obedience pressures to do some behavior, and then if you didn't do that behavior, you would be both a nonconformist and disobedient. Does that make sense? The question was, is there ever a situation where disobedience involves nonconformity? Since I'm saying they're not the same thing, do they ever co-occur? And they definitely do co-occur quite a bit. Remember that obedience pressures are so high and the tendency to follow orders is so strong that it would probably typically be the case that if multiple people are getting orders, that you would then face both obedience pressures and conformity pressures as everybody else falls in line with these orders. Then you would be like, oh, not only do I feel the pressure to follow orders, but I also feel the pressure to act like my peers. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So after reading a few times about the ASH study, I was wondering, was this ever addressed by our whole legal system in terms of a jury trial and the effects of conformity? When you're talking about somebody's conviction and the pressure of conformity?
Yes. Has conformity pressure ever been applied to understand the dynamics of juries and possibly reform dynamics of juries? For example, might it be best for juries not to deliberate as a group, but maybe deliberate as individuals, since they might exert influence over one another? And we certainly wouldn't want it to be the case that maybe a very influential person could swing whether somebody's guilty or innocent just because they happen to be on that randomly assigned to that jury. Yeah, research has definitely been done on conformity dynamics in jury settings, though it hasn't led to significant reform of the way that juries work. Though there may be all these good reasons for that I don't know about. They may have found in the research that group deliberation is helpful for coming to the right decisions. I don't really know. But there is conformity research on jury dynamics. And there's a wonderful, wonderful film, which a lot of people watch in social psychology classes, but you won't watch here, called 12 Angry Men, that's about interpersonal influence and conformity dynamics in jury settings. You should check it out. It's really good. Yes, last question, then we'll get back to lecture. Yeah. Nope, it's not your fault.
Conformity dynamics when someone's being very non-conformist in terms of like early goth people, and then that becomes something that people conform to when they're, copying what other people do.
Yeah.
Is it like a 50-50 thing where it switches from non-conformity to conformity?
Yeah. The question is, can nonconformity ever kind of exert its own conformity pressure? And that's sort of that's like the Berkeley dilemma, right? Is how can you not conform in a place where nonconformity is conformist or normative? Yeah. So I mean, I think it's the case that certain styles of nonconformity, like being goth or whatever, can then become their own subcultures that exert their own conformist pressures, and really, really quickly, right? Like if you look at the uniformity of the way goth people dress, I mean, there's clearly conformity going on in that nonconformity. The same goes for the way punk people dress. The way really any subculture that has an identifiable pattern style of dress or appearance or speech or whatever, there's clearly conformity going on. One wonders what it would be like to have true, pure nonconformists that literally look like no one else in the way that they adorn themselves. They'd probably look like Nathan walking around Target. Yeah. So yeah, I agree. Nonconformity can, eventually kind of hit a critical mass and become its own sort of conformity. Okay, so getting back to this big takeaway, that's one of the biggest takeaways from the class that you're going to hear me talk about on the first day of class and the last day of class. The situation matters, not the individual. Well, I'm not going to say the individual doesn't matter, but you come to this class to find out how much the situation does. And one of the big stories you're going to get from this class is the situation matters more than you realize, more than most people realize, and more than they realize when they walk into a social psychology class. That's why the fundamental attribution error exists. That's why we tend to do the correspondence bias when we make attributions. Because, well, for one, is focalism, yada, 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 but it's also because we have a lay theory that personality creates behavior. And so when we see somebody do something, well, we see somebody do that thing, right? We don't see the context that created and shaped their behavior. So obedience to authority in the Milgram experiment, the patterns we see across the different conditions, where we can create a condition where everybody obeys, and we can create a condition where essentially no one obeys, yields the very real possibility that we would all of us, very likely obey under some circumstances, and regardless of our personalities. And there isn't a single person in this room that even believes that right now, I would bet. I bet that every person in this room thinks, I'm the 1%. I'm the one person that wouldn't obey authority in that setting. I mean, right now, I'm telling you that everybody in this room could be made to obey under some sort of circumstances, or virtually everyone. And I'm thinking myself, I'm the exception, of course, If you're anything like me, oh, that's great. Somebody doesn't think they're the exception. That's brave. I'm impressed. But if you're anything like me, you think, no, yeah, everybody else obeys authority, everybody else conforms, and I'm a little bit different. But again, we can create conditions where everybody obeys. So the fundamental attribution error speaks to this issue of how the situation matters more than the individual. We assume that individual differences matter more than they do. We think that our personality will lead us to defy orders or defy conformity pressures or influence, but it's just not so, or it's just not always so. And this suggests an even bigger conclusion, well, maybe not a bigger conclusion, but a very important one, which is that evil tends to adhere, whatever the hell evil is, whatever we have in mind when we say that, it tends to adhere in situations more than individuals. Milgram had this great idea, well, whatever, controversial idea, but a clever idea, that I can create conditions in which anybody, the banker, the butcher, your mother, can behave, your mother, sorry, that was a little too much in your kitchen there, sorry. Anybody would behave in an evil way. And so, if you were asked to guess if a single person would obey, would you want to know about the setting or the person? And I think in the Milgram experiment, you want to know about the setting. Okay. Other relevant research. Any questions about this? Other relevant? Oh, yes, Christy.
Okay, so when I think about conformity, like in the most basic way, I use the idiom monkey see, monkey do.
Uh-huh.
So do you have like a silly idiom that I can apply to obedience?
I don't know. Is there an equivalent of monkey see, monkey do for obedience to authority? I don't know. Just like you tend to obey authority. I don't know. I'm sorry. I can't stop doing it like a social psychologist. Like people tend to obey orders from authority figures. Yeah. That's the only way I can do it. I'm sorry. Yeah. And if you say monkey see, monkey do on the test, I mean, we might not, Luckily, you already got through that test. Okay. So, other relevant research. Excellent question, but I answered it poorly. Okay, other relevant research. Sheridan and King, 1972, replicated the Milgram experiment. These are just weird experiments now. This is just me telling you the wacky stuff that social psychologists do. They made a real victim a puppy. They got a puppy. Yeah, I know. How messed up is that? I know. And they attached electroshocks to a puppy, and they were like, oh yeah, this Milgram experiment, this is all well and good, but what about if there's a puppy for a victim? Like, that is not well understood. We need to, do this research immediately, post-haste. Somebody needs to figure out what happens when it's a puppy. And they're like, and also, what if it was real shocks, right? Yeah, exactly. What is the reasoning here? It's crazy. So it received real shocks, and, the puppy did not enjoy this at all. Was not shocked to death. They didn't have like an equivalent of like a 450 XXX level, thank God. And the results, 77% obedience. Right, so thank God we ran that experiment. Right, that's it. That's all they found. That's it. Yeah, so great, yeah. Right, the puppy couldn't answer questions, so how did they do this? Well, but it was trained to like follow orders, and then if it didn't follow the orders, then they would shock it. Like sit, roll over, shake. Oh, that's interesting. So then it was not pre-trained so that it had a high rate of disobedience. Yeah, I think that, no, so it had a high failure rate. And I don't know what the learning task was. I didn't read this paper. It's disgusting to me. So, but it's much talked about as this classic example of just disgustingly unethical research. And I don't know, it's some kind of, training task that the puppy was given. And the puppy just couldn't learn, so it had to be shocked, right? I know. So, okay, here's another one. Oh no, this is interesting. This is not free. Well, this is freaky, but it's also really interesting. So Rogers and Prentice Dunn in 1981 replicated the Milgram experiment, and here's a graph of the results. They had different victims, different people in the learner position, rather than always having that one dude with the glasses from the film. or whoever it was in the replication, they would either have a black victim or a white victim and in the role, and otherwise try to make sure they're about the same levels of attractiveness, height, and so on. They're both men, I believe, the victim. And they were interested in, would these subjects in the study be more likely go to a higher level in obeying orders to shock a black victim than a white victim, or maybe the other way around. They were interested in this. And this is the mean level of intensity of shock administered. This is 1981. And so in the normal condition, the control condition, subjects in the study actually shocked the black victim a little bit less than the white victim for whatever reason. But if in the beginning of the experiment, when they were waiting to go into the experiment, the victim had insulted the subject, somehow provoked them by saying something rude to them, then it switched. The pattern was switched, and the black victim was shocked at a higher level on average than the white victim, which is very, very interesting, I think. Okay, that's all I have for that. You would interpret that however you will. Okay, so one of the big questions of the yes, ma'am. I believe that they were mostly white, because it's like college students from 1981. It's like mostly white, but not 100%. I think they just used like a normal distribution of subjects that they got from their subject pool. So probably 90% white. I don't know. And not enough people that weren't white to do separate statistical analyses of those that would be reliable at all. So you can basically assume that these are white teachers, subjects. Okay. That's the third straight year somebody's asked me that, because it's like this obvious question, and I totally don't have a great answer. I'm sorry. So table 3. Oh, I don't know why this is table 3. I got this from a book by Michael Rosenfeld, who's an assistant professor at Stanford University. Oh my God, it's terrible because Michael's like a decent guy, but I know that seems implausible. Yeah. So one of the big questions with the Milgram experiment is we find that people will obey just as much in the Milgram experiment now as they would in the early 60s. And so this would make you think that, in general, obedience to authority as a value in society or as a practice in society hasn't changed over time. And I would say that, yes, in a situation when somebody, an overbearing person in a position of authority with legitimate authority is giving you direct orders, yes, all evidence suggests in America people are just as likely to obey those orders now as they were in 1961 or 1962. But a larger question, as long as we're talking about obedience to authority, is obedience as a trait of individuals, as a value, as a social value, like obedience to your parents, obedience to your teachers, that kind of thing. What's been going on with that over time? What's been going on with obedience as a value over the course of American history? And this is very hard to study. A lot of our really interesting questions we'd like to be able to study about culture, about American history, about world history, are very difficult to study because we just don't have great data to speak to these issues. So one attempt that was made to study trends in obedience as a value over time was done using the Middletown data set. Has anybody ever heard of the Middletown studies? Raise your hand if you have. Okay. All right. That's a brave. There's a couple brave, very, very studious people. I encourage that. That's good. So I know about the Milgram experiments, or sorry, the Middletown studies. The Middletown studies were studies that were done in the middle part of the early, middle, and later part of the 20th century by sociologists. And what they wanted to do was do community studies. They wanted to study how does a normal, average community in the middle of America function, and how do the people behave. And what they did was they picked, can you not text message in my class? They picked an average community, and they called it Middletown, and they actually protected its secrecy because they did all these studies of like the mayor and the city council and the people, and you could figure out who these people were if you knew what town it was. And so it's a big, big secret what Middletown is, and it's Muncie, Indiana. And they went to Middletown, they studied it for a long time. And so they did one wave of survey studies in 1924, and then they went back in 1978 and did another wave of studies. And they asked people, they asked women who were, moms, to what extent are these traits among the 3 most desirable traits for your children to have? So in 1924, they asked people from this big list of traits, I'm not giving you the whole list, there's like 10 or 15, would one of these appear on your top 3 list of traits you want your kid to have? And so these are the percentages that say each one in 1924 in 1978. And then they also asked them, can you guess or approximate how your mom would have answered this question based on your experiences with your mom? And so we're able to recover very unreliable retrospective data from that. So I know, it's not perfect. Like if I'm going to ask you, how much do you want to raise your kids to be obedient to authority, you could probably answer that, reasonably well. You have some sense of that. If I asked you how much did your mom want to do it, you'd answer it okay, but not great. So that's why we put question marks next to these data, because they're not that good. And we're estimating that the moms, these moms are estimating how their moms would answer the question, and we estimate that if those surveys had actually happened, they would have been about 1900. And if this one had happened, it would have been about 1954. Does this make sense? Okay. Any questions about this? Okay, so these are the real data, and these are the guesses of like mom's data. And then these are trends over time in the percentage of times this is listed in the top 3. So here are a couple non-obedience items, like tolerance for others, respecting other people's opinions even if they're opposed to your own. That's not exactly disobedience, but it's like independence kind of, or respecting other people's independence. So tolerance as a value was not a very central value that you'd raise your kids with in the early part of the 20th century. But right around the middle of the 20th century, possibly influenced by the rise of the civil rights movement, it starts to get on the map a little bit more. And then by 1978, it's one of the most central values that's getting mentioned here. So respect for the independence of other people's opinions and their identities and whatnot is increasing over the course of the 20th century. More important for our purposes, here's data on independence, the ability for your kid to think and act for his or herself. And at the beginning of the beginning of the century, only like 16% of people are saying that they want that. They're like, want my kid to think and act for him or herself? No, I don't want that, actually. I want them to behave the way I tell them to. And then, by 1924, this is up, and then it's up higher in 1984, and then something happens in between here. You might call it the 1960s, and the Berkeley effect. We changed this, and rates of valuing independence as a central value in your children shoots up to 76%, to, I believe, maybe the biggest value cited, which is very interesting, that now, and presumably this might even have gone up since then, that now independence is something parents want their kids to have. Now, that is not a traditional view of parenting, right? Like parents in the old school wanted their kids to follow their orders, and we'll see that next. So, how much of them said strict obedience, loyalty to the church, and good manners? All sort of measures of some sort of obedience. And strict obedience as a value goes down, perfectly mirroring, or almost perfectly mirroring, the rise of independence. Goes down from being a dominant value to being, not so much on the map by here. Pretty much switching places with independence, And then loyalty to the church declines as a central value, and the priority put on good manners goes down as well, which I think if any of you have ever had lunch with me, you would be able to speak to that. So basically, there's this decline in the centrality of the value of obedience to authority, and a rise in the value of independence over the course of the 20th century, and that this probably explains a lot. Any questions about this? Yes. Yes, they're all moms being asked what kinds of values would you like to raise your kids with. You may say, why didn't they interview dads? And I don't really have a great answer to that. No other questions? Okay, cool. So it's interesting. So now we have two pieces of kind of conflicting data, right? Bless you. We have two pieces of kind of conflicting data. The one where rates of obedience in the actual Milgram experiment are hanging steady, right? They're not declining. And this is situational obedience. When somebody's barking in orders in your ear, will you do it? And the evidence is, yeah, you will, even if it's pretty extreme. But in terms of how much we as a society value obedience and how much parents try to raise their kids with that, it's been steadily declining. Okay. So, one of the big questions, I'm not saying that's the answer, by the way. I'm going to present, I'm sorry, one of the big questions that you're probably asking yourself now is, was the Milgram experiment ethical? Or maybe you've already answered that. You probably have already answered that in your head. Was the Milgram experiment ethical? Should they even have done the replication in Santa Clara? So let's do a quick straw poll. I'm not saying the answer is yes. God, I'm not saying that. I'm about to present some evidence both ways. But let's do a quick straw poll. How many people would say that the Milgram experiment is not ethical. Let's say that first. So you raise your hands, and there's okay, there's a lot of hands. How many people would say the Milgram experiment was ethical or was acceptable ethically? Very interesting. Very interesting. I would say that's about 50-50. Do you agree? Wow, this is wonderful. Okay, if this were a discussion section, we'd be about to have a great discussion about this, but it's not a discussion section, so sorry about that. Okay, so I hope you all feel like you've now expressed yourself in your opinion of the material. Boy, I wish we had discussion sections in this class. Okay, so was the Milgram experiment ethical? Okay, here's some arguments for why it was. Yes, he surveyed people afterwards, and very few people complained. And he did a very serious job about this. Like, he sent surveys to tons of people, and very few people said, I feel like I was mistreated, or I feel like this experiment was wrong. And that's probably because he made this effort to explain to them after the fact what the point of the experiment was. Or I'm guessing that's part of why people responded in that way. And then another answer, and this used to be what I would say, I flipped back and forth, by the way, on whether I think it's ethical or not. I think when I was an undergrad, I thought it was unethical. When I was a second-year grad student and watched it, I thought it was ethical. And then I thought it wasn't ethical, like, later the same year. And then later, when we started projecting it across, like, the dance floor at grad student parties, I was like, I don't even know if it's ethical or not, you know. And then now I don't know what I think. Now I'd say, I'm torn. Okay, so the people could have disobeyed. And this is what I used to say. The people could have disobeyed. Milgram created a situation, but he didn't make them do it. You know, he didn't make them press those buttons. And so they ultimately, I would say, and in our legal system, if they had actually killed somebody, they would have been held responsible. Ultimately, they didn't have to obey. And so if they found it a traumatic experience, well, maybe they have themselves to blame. But then again, this is sort of at odds with my person situation takeaway, right? Because I'm also telling you 100% of people will obey in certain circumstances and only 10% in another. So then who really is responsible for the rates of obedience? Milgram or the subjects in the study? Probably Milgram, right? Okay, so this is a controversial thesis. And probably the best reason why the Milgram experiment was ethical, or was at least acceptable ethically, is that the research is very insightful and teaches us important lessons about obedience to authority that might actually be useful for undermining future obedience to authority. Okay, so I think that's probably the best argument for why it's ethical, is we learn a lot about a bad phenomenon from having done a few really bad studies, what Milgram did, that were maybe traumatic to people. Okay, so why might it not be ethical? I mean, you all probably have your own takes on this, but this is just some of my take. There's way too much stress in the situation. We would never accept a study proposal now through a human subjects committee that would suggest this much stress. Indeed, even in the Santa Clara replication, they topped out at, what, 150 volts or something like that? So they wouldn't go all the way. They didn't have these people really thinking maybe they killed somebody. Too much stress in the situation. Also, there's a standard of ethical conduct in experimental and other research that the researchers must return subjects to the state that they entered the study in. So if you showed up that day happy or sad or not thinking you were a murderer, we need to, at the end of the study, return you to that state because we can't play God with your lives, right? We're only paying you like $20, so or way less, actually. So this is a very important standard, and I think it's a reasonable one. Researchers shouldn't be able to play God and actually change your life. But there's good reason in the Milgram experiment that people were discovering fundamental, freaky things about themselves as a result of participating in the study. Also, people were surveyed much later and said that they were significantly affected. So when Milgram did his surveys and said, hey, did I mess you up? Are you okay? They'd be like, no, sir, you know, you didn't mess me up. And is that surprising, right? I mean, these surveys probably aren't reliable. These people were willing to murder somebody when Milgram told them to, and then he asked them, oh, are you offended? Is everything okay? And they're like, yes, 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 you know. But when other people went back and surveyed some of the Milgram participants, they found somewhat different news, that some people were upset by it and still upset by it and felt significantly affected by the experience. So that suggests his surveys were unreliable and were maybe themselves subject to obedience effects. Okay, so it's ultimately a tough call. And then this is the big takeaway is we could have different opinions about the actual Milgram experiment itself, but the stuff that came after it was messed up. The shocking the puppy thing, that's absurd. There was also a study done, I believe, in Turkey in the 80s where they had, I think it was 8 and 10-year-olds do the Milgram experiment, and which is, you know, completely unacceptable even in Milgram's time in the United States. And like the study has all sorts of messed up stuff like, you know, the 8-year-olds were more obedient but showed more like emotional discomfort with following the orders and stuff like that. And there was actually there's like this mini crisis where an American psychology journal accepted this article for publication, and people wrote back and were like, what are you doing? You're encouraging very unethical research by American psychology standards. And they said, yes, but it's not American psychology's job to tell Turkey what their psychology ethical standards should be. And there was this controversy over, whether that should have been encouraged or published, or whether we should obey the ethical standards of different countries' research standards and whatnot. And now I don't think you could conduct that study in Turkey. But there was a question there. Yes, sir. Yes, this is similar to a question we had on Thursday. Wouldn't the later findings be unreliable because the people are influenced by the prior publication of results in the Milgram experiment? Maybe, but you have to understand that the Milgram experiment as a ubiquitous thing that everybody knows about hasn't really happened until about the last 10 years. Like when I was learning about the Milgram experiment, this was still like a pretty unusual thing to learn about it. And that was, God, many, many years ago, like 11 or 12 years ago. And now it seems like everybody knows about the Milgram experiment, but that would have been very unusual in the 80s and the 70s. People really wouldn't know about it. Like the William Shatner movie was a made-for-TV movie that wasn't very popular and wasn't very good. So not everybody saw that, so that's sort of my answer to your question. Yeah. Okay. Real-world relevance. How does this relate to the real world? Well, it relates to the real world in really obvious ways, but it relates to the real world in some very specific ways as well. So one of the big takeaways, as I've told you, is evil behavior is perhaps most likely when responsibility is cut up. Oh, I haven't mentioned this yet. Evil behavior is perhaps most likely when it's cut up into small parts, right? Where somebody has to originate orders, and then they pass them on to somebody else. And then that person passes on the orders as well. Remember that one of the highest rates of obedience was found in the study where the person, what do? They get orders, and then they just have to relay them to somebody else, right? And the rate of obedience there is like 90% or something. So if you don't actually have to press the button yourself, and all you have to do is just get the order and then tell it to somebody else, then all of a sudden obedience is almost 100% again. So if you're just a cog in a larger machine that's creating, shall we say, evil behavior, it can run very fluidly with very high rates of obedience from its participants, even if you're doing terrible, terrible things. And one thing you'll notice is that when we do see horrible, horrible extreme acts of human behavior, like prison abuse or genocide, concentration camps, unethical medical experiments, we find these examples of extreme obedience to authority leading to horrible, horrible human outcomes. We often see that it's because there's a hierarchy where every person in this hierarchy is delegated some little part of the larger task. When one person's responsible for the whole thing, people aren't capable of perhaps the extent of evil that they are as if it's chunked in an organization into smaller parts. Why is that? Probably because when it's chunked like that, when it's cut up into discrete smaller tasks, the feeling of individual responsibility for any person in the chain is minimized. Also, okay, so then organization, can you all be quiet back there? Yes, thank you. Organizations and groups, governments, bureaucracies, gangs, corporations, mobs, which don't seem to have much in common, but they do have a lot in common in that they're capable of terrible, destructive, antisocial acts, and that they're subject to these principles. That when we chunk up the evil behavior into discrete, smaller parts, then it's more likely to happen. So they're very capable of extreme antisocial behavior. And so some of these examples would include groupthink, bystander non-intervention, the diffusion of responsibility, and obedience to authority. All of these become more likely in such settings, in organizational settings, actually. So, okay. So this very specific real-world relevance is the Adolf Eichmann trial. And Adolf Eichmann was a former high-ranking Nazi official, and really a bureaucrat. He was in the condition of the study where the person took orders from the originator of the orders and then gave them to this other person who had to press the button. That was kind of him, that 90% condition. And that was exactly his defense. He claimed that he was just following orders. He said, look, I'm in the 90% condition of the Milgram experiment here. I only transmitted instructions in a bureaucracy that was created by an evil person, Adolf Hitler. But I wasn't evil. I did what anybody else would do. I was just following orders. And the Eichmann trial, the world was transfixed by the Eichmann trial. It was this big thing. It happened from, I believe, 1968 to like or 1959, 1962, he was caught by that famous Nazi hunter somewhere in South America. He fled Germany following World War II to South America and had hung out, hid there for like 15, 16 years before being found by, does anybody know the name of the famous Nazi hunter? He's played by Laurence Olivier in The Boys from Brazil. Damn. Anyway, he's cool. So, so he found Adolf Eichmann and took him to trial. And what they did in those days is they take you to a sort of world court, an international court, and try you for crimes against humanity when they found these Nazis who had fled Germany. And this was his defense. And it became this kind of famous seminal defense of, is this an acceptable defense? Can you just say, I'm just accepting orders, I'm just following orders? And you can't. Well, at least Eichmann didn't get away with it. So he was nonetheless found guilty and hung in 1962. And actually the Kurt Vonnegut book, Mother Night, has a very interesting sort of commentary on this. And one thing I was going to say is, think about the timing, right? The Eichmann trial happens around 1960 or so. In fact, the Eichmann trial happens about 2 or 3 months before Milgram ran his first experiment. And Milgram had a lot of Jewish family in New York, and supposedly was very affected by the Eichmann trial. And though we don't know this, it may have been the direct impetus for the Milgram experiments. So where he wanted to understand the dynamics of this just following orders type phenomenon. Any questions about that? Okay. All right, moving on from the Eichmann trial. Okay, so a little recap on Milgram's life. I find Stanley Milgram very interesting. I suggest that you read the Milgram biography, The Man Who Shocked the World, despite the silly title. Thomas Blass just sent me an email saying that it's now available in paperback. So there you go. It's cheaper now. So Milgram was born in 1933 in the Bronx. And in 1954, he received his bachelor's degree in political science from Queens College. And then in 1960, he received his PhD from Harvard, where he studied primarily with Gordon Allport, who had a dirt fetish, as you remember, and Solomon Asch, who constructed the Asch experiment. And in the spring, and I should say that for his dissertation, Milgram was going to replicate the Asch experiment in France and Norway. Oh, I already told you that when we were talking about the Asch experiment. So then in the spring of 1960, Milgram gets the idea for the obedience trials, possibly influenced by the Eichmann capture and trial. And this is when he's an assistant professor at Yale from 1960 to 1962. And this essentially makes his career. Instantly, everybody knows about the results. They're a big deal. He presents them at conferences. And everybody in psychology, which is, everybody in social psychology, so this group of very, very dorky people, such as myself, we're all very, very excited about Stanley Milgram. And he becomes sort of an instant academic celebrity. Then from so he gets hired back by Harvard from 1962 to 1967. He was an assistant professor there. He was denied tenure, which is a little bit surprising because he's an incredibly famous social psychologist. But Harvard tends to deny tenure to everybody because they're like that. So then from 1967 to 1984, he wound up being a professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. So he lived in New York, and he did all these kind of city-based studies, like, for example, the subway study, right, where he did the breaching on the subway. And so he got really into the life of New York City, and and he got to go back to his home. And then, sadly, in 1984, he died of a heart attack, his third heart attack, actually, at age 51. It does suck. So Milgram, a few more things about Milgram's life. He identified the small worlds phenomenon. Have any of you heard of the small worlds phenomenon? Or have any of you, what's up? All right, thank you. Good. 3 of you. Good. Okay, so the small worlds phenomenon is this idea that we're all more closely connected in the world than we maybe think we are. Have you ever seen the movie or play 6 Degrees of Separation? Or familiar with the Facebook application, 6 Degrees of Separation? Yeah. So Milgram ran that original experiment that's cited in the 6 Degrees of Separation movie, actually. I think, one of the characters talks about it, and it makes for the title. And the idea, what he did was he mailed letters out. This is completely unrelated to obedience to authority, but it is related to Milgram, and it's very interesting. He mailed letters out to random people in America and said, okay, try to mail this letter or this package or whatever, this note to somebody else in America, and I've randomly picked them. It's like Joe in Kansas. Try and send it to Joe in Kansas. Well, they gave the last name, obviously, and his profession, and people would do the best they could, right? If they couldn't get to Joe Smith in Kansas, they'd send it, to Nancy whoever in Tennessee who's like closer to Kansas than anybody else they know. Or they'd send it to somebody who's in the same profession or whatever. And Milgram counted the number of mailings it took on average for it to get from a random American to another random American, and found it took 6 mailings, with the suggestion being that on average, We're about 6 degrees separated from one another. Any stranger in this country, you're about 6 degrees separated from. And then they've rerun that study on a global scale as well. There's talking going on that's bothering me. I can't even see. It's very sneaky talking. Very sneaky. Maybe I'm even hallucinating it. I don't know. But I'm starting to lose it. You guys are playing tricks on my mind. You've got into my head. So it's a very interesting experiment. And it has this very nice, sweet takeaway, right? That we're all more connected than maybe we thought we were. 6 degrees of separation. Also, he believed he was denied tenure by Robert Bales, that was the guy primarily responsible for denying him tenure at Harvard. That may have been a paranoid conspiracy theory, who knows? But Robert Bales is the guy who influenced the rise of the status characteristics theory tradition in sociology, in sociological social psychology, which you'll be learning in a couple weeks. So as you read that, think of Robert Bales screwing with Stanley Milgram's career. He also experimented with drugs, which is interesting. It was a condition of his hire at Harvard that he not do any experiments with drugs because he was considered this kind of, loose cannon. He did these wild obedience experiments, and they wanted to give him a job because of them, but they were also worried he was going to start. They knew he was doing some drugs. They didn't want him doing experiments with drugs. Why did they not want him to do experiments with drugs? What significant Harvard psychology professor would have led them to think, this is a bad idea? He got his PhD from here, from the Berkeley Psychology Department. He dropped acid with his students. Big no-no. There we go. Timothy Leary. Thank you. So Timothy Leary had gotten his tenure revoked at Harvard. Very, very unusual thing. Almost never, ever happens. Less than 0.1% of the time. He had his tenure revoked because he was dropping acid with his students, and for some reason this was looked down upon. So when they hired Milgram, they're like, okay, but enough with the drugs. So, and he actually wrote a chapter of the Handbook of Social Psychology on mescaline. And I've read that chapter, and you can't tell. It seems fine. It's like, that's how you're on mescaline? That's weird. Because you're not that different than you probably are normally. And then he also was just a weird guy. He would go to he went to the office one time or a few times, and he would say, okay, today, all of my graduate students, when we speak, we must sing to one another. Probably one of those times he was on mescaline. Okay, so some quotes about obedience to authority. When you think of the long and gloomy history of man, you will find more hideous crimes have been committed in the name of disobedience than have ever been committed in the name of rebellion. C.P. Snow. This is a good one. Mario Savio. There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part, you can't even passively take part, and you got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. Which was said on Sproul Plaza, I think, right? I think so. Oscar Wilde. Disobedience, in the eyes of anyone who has read history, is man's original virtue. It is through disobedience that progress has been made. Henry David Thoreau, disobedience is the true foundation of liberty. The obedient must be slaves. Einstein, who's disobeying clearly there, never do anything against conscience, even if the state demands it. And Martin Luther King, an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. You're actually not allowed to leave yet. You're actually not allowed to leave. Because we're a little bit behind, and so we have to talk a little bit about the Zimbardo experiment. So let's take a 1-minute break, and then we'll talk about the Zimbardo experiment before we get started. Okay, we will now segue to the next most famously, possibly extraordinarily unethical study in the entire history of social psychology, which is the Stanford prison study. Boo, 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 boo. I apologize. It's a weird anomaly of history that so much good social psychology has come out of that horrible, horrible institution. It's really inexplicable, but I promise you, we'll try to cover that research as little as possible because I don't want to bother you. Okay, so the Stanford prison study was conducted in 1971, and it was influenced by high awareness of inhumane prison conditions at the time. Oh, I should say as a preface to all this that on Thursday of this week, you will watch the Stanford prison experiment. So that'll... Yes, exactly. I love that there's at least mild booing and hissing every time I even say the word. That's excellent. On Thursday, you're going to come in, you're going to turn in your assignment, and then we're going to chill out and relax and watch a film about ritual prison abuse. So, okay, so the study was conducted in 1971, and it was influenced by an increasingly high awareness of inhumane prison conditions that were going on in the country at the time. So, for example, the Attica prison riots had happened in 1971, leaving 40 people dead. And the study, okay, well, and there was one of the reasons that the Attica prison riots had happened, and they had a big influence on Americans' perceptions of prisons at the time, and influenced a wave of prison reform that hadn't been seen since the late 19th century. And one of the reasons that the Attica prison riots had happened was that, on average, prisoners in Attica prison, I don't have the numbers exactly here, they would wait about, I believe, 8 years to get a parole hearing, which would then last less than 30 minutes. And so these prisoners, you know, had presumably done stuff to be in prison, right? But their conditions were horrible, and they saw no hope. They weren't being reformed, and they were ripe for riots, and they were being treated terribly. Or that was the belief of many people at the time. So the study was sort of influenced by this and wanted to show the horrible things that can happen when prison conditions become extremely horrible. By the way, did you see this article in CNN yesterday saying that 1 in 31 Americans is in prison right now? Like 1 in 31. Which, by the way, is a testimony to how we tend to know people that are like ourselves, because I don't think anybody in prison right now, or in jail, because I think it counted a wide variety of people. But if I had totally representative social networks, 1 in 30 people I would know would be in prison. So, like, you know, so what do you have, like 200 Facebook friends? Or you guys are laughing, you're like, I have 700 Facebook friends. But whatever it is, imagine if you had 600 Facebook friends, if 22 of them were in jail right now, you know? How nuts is that? But that's what it would be if we knew a representative set of Americans. So I would argue these things are still relevant just because of the sheer number of people that are in prison in the contemporary U.S. So what they did in the study is they took 24 participants that were recruited from the community, and they randomly assigned them to be guards or prisoners. And the differences in behavior, as a result, must be attributable to the roles that they were randomly assigned, okay? So he's randomly assigning people to the guard or the prisoner role, so that if we reran the study with the same people, it's as likely that the prisoners would become guards as the guards would become prisoners. So when we watch the film on Thursday, the way the guards behave differently than the prisoners, it's important to remember they could have easily been the opposite roles. So the people you see behaving terribly as guards could have been the people receiving that terrible punishment, and vice versa. The study featured a bizarrely high attention to detail. Participants were actually arrested and booked and made to wear prison outfits. They were deloused, which couldn't have been pleasant. And there were visiting hours. There was a prison chaplain. There was a parole hearing at one point, which went poorly. And Phil Zimbardo, the Stanford social psychology professor that came up with the study, went ahead and cast himself as the prison superintendent who worked with the guards to keep the prisoners in line in the study. And so some of the findings were, the basic finding of this is that participants took on their roles and enacted extreme behavior. And the guards mentally abused the prisoners. They asked the prisoners to strip. They used sleep deprivation. They asked them to make weird homoerotic advances on one another. They humiliated their fellow prisoners who disobeyed. And some of the prisoners broke down mentally. And one tried to break back into the prison. One went on a hunger strike. Both those people left the study early. One became a prison psychiatrist eventually. And it was discontinued after 6 days. I don't want to give you too much of these details because I want you to watch it and enjoy it. But I've just given away the ending. So the Stanford prison study, some conclusions are, and I want you to watch for evidence for this as you watch the film, because it's very likely that there might be an essay question on an exam about the Stanford prison experiment, wherein you'll be asked to apply concepts from the class to it, which is why I'm previewing the material now before it happens. The Stanford prison study underscores the power of the situation. So what do we mean by that? We mean that there's a strong role of situational factors in determining behavior. You know, this whole screed that I went off on in the middle of the lecture today about how if you wanted to know if somebody would obey in the Milgram experiment, what would you want to know? Their personality or what condition they were in? And you'd want to know what condition they were assigned to. Well, that's the same idea as the power of the situation. This is this idea that the situation looms large in determining human behavior. But this is a novel thing. This is something you have to go to college and learn, or look around social life very carefully and learn, because we tend to underestimate the power of the situation due to, among other things, the fundamental attribution error, the tendency to make dispositional attributions when we ought to make situational ones. So the guards barely ever used any physical force in the study because they didn't have to. the situation was believed to be real, so it became real in its consequences. And so this is an illustration of the Thomas theorem. If men define situations as real, they become real in their consequences. That's how strong situations are. They don't even have to be real. It doesn't have to be a real prison. The prison guards don't really have to use any physical force, and yet they can get these people to humiliate themselves and do humiliating things, because if men define situations as real, they become real in their consequences. And actually, this relates to a quote that I have on my office door, because I think it's great, by Kurt Vonnegut, that is, be careful what you pretend to be, because for all intents and purposes, socially, you are what you pretend to be. So that's a Kurt Vonnegut quote. Rest in peace. And we'll see each other on Thursday, where you will watch the Zimbardo film, and you will look for evidence of the power of the situation, and you will overlook the terrible fact that it was conducted at Stanford University.